My name is Alan Reid. I work at Monash University in the Faculty of Education, where I'm a Professor of Education. Until 2012, I worked at the University of Bath Centre for Research in Education and Environment, where I did my PhD in the 1990s with Bill Scott, who started the journal Environmental Education Research. Since the mid-2000s, I've been the editor of Environmental Education Research, which has been a great privilege to learn from many scholars around the world about their research and inquiries to improve environmental education policy and practice and development activities to link environmental and educational priorities together. I have been involved in the field of environmental education for many years, formally through things like academic qualifications. I was an undergraduate student in environmental science and geography, a geography teacher for a short while in Oxford, and I did my PhD in the 90s looking at how teachers develop pupils' environmental education through the study of local issues. I've returned to many of the themes from my PhD times throughout my career as a researcher. I'm particularly interested in things like the philosophy and thinking of teachers and how that interacts with different curriculum documentation, opportunities within the school system in particular to develop different approaches to environmental education in the curriculum, the co-curriculum and the extracurricular spaces. I have also been involved in work in outdoor education and outdoor learning, and I'm particularly interested in the role of fieldwork and experiences which provide something a little different to the traditional ways of thinking about curriculum content and assessment priorities and pedagogies in the classroom. One of the highlights of working in an international field is to interact with many scholars and experts from around the world. For many years I've had the privilege of going to lots of different conferences and interacting with early career researchers, mid-career researchers and senior colleagues, and it's a great opportunity to learn from their wisdom, to be inspired, to get re-energised and to think differently about where the field is going. Particularly in my connections with colleagues in North America, I've got to know and deeply appreciate the work of the North American Association for Environmental Education and been an advisor to things like the Global Environmental Education Partnership. And organisations like this have as their central mission a strong commitment to professional learning, a vibrant culture for practitioners, for policymakers and interactions with research and evaluation. And I find that that is a very healthy ecosystem for people to be involved in and to appreciate. It gets academics out of the ivory tower. It gets them to engage with projects to improve practice which are relevant to the needs of the field and practitioners in all sorts of different spaces, whether it's in outdoor learning spaces, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in field centres, whether it's in urban study centres, in museums, zoos, aquariums, science centres, in the media, in conservation work, in lots of varieties of spaces which can be used to offer environmental education provision. Within that kind of complex landscape and terrain for environmental education, I think it's important that we return to the theme about the growth and development and spread of core, useful, practical ideas that people can understand and they can engage with and critique for themselves. Coming up with a field which seems distant, mired in theoretical concepts which don't make sense in reality or are obtuse doesn't, in my experience, help people. And I know from reading submissions to environmental education research and looking at things like which articles get well read, well cited, it's often those that have a clear message about what a study has found, the limitations of the study, as well as the implications of that study for different stakeholders within the field. One of the questions that I've been asked to reflect on is which publications in environmental education are significant to me. I would say that one of the blind spots that academics can have is that they rely on journals too much. They like reading academic papers, but that's a particular genre of communicating about what's going on in the field and how we might think about the field. And there's a particular discourse associated with that. So whenever I'm involved in thinking about the kinds of publications which are important, I often try to think, like in this library space that we're in now, what's the range of material which is possible and how has that shifted over time, and what kinds of different materials can we use to encourage our thinking to change and to shift. So in a recent project with Nicole Ardwin from Stanford University, we've been involved in developing a bibliography on environmental education, and within that we've deliberately tried to blend together a number of different documents. So one thing which for us has been important is to consider things like policy documents. If you go back to the US Acts in the 1970s and in 1990 when it was renewed on environmental education, you can see a strong sense there to an understanding that for environmental education provision to happen, you need to build the infrastructure for the field. So there are commitments within those acts to developing advisory councils, grant schemes, professional development courses, and other core ideas which help maintain the workforce within this field. If you read just journal articles, sometimes you forget that there are important aspects to how the field is funded and how it is sustained and how it grows over time and perhaps interacts with other fields of inquiry. So as another example from the bibliography, we have a section there which looks at things like the eclipsing of environmental education as UNESCO and UNEP parted ways, particularly in the 90s, as to what their focus might be in the education space. So while UNEP and UNESCO had been heavily involved in developing the International Environmental Education Programme from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, particularly after things like the World Conservation Strategy, the Brundtland Commission, the Rio Earth Summit, we began to see much more of an emphasis in UNESCO's work on education for sustainable development. When we reflect on the kinds of shifts which happen there, again, if we look at newsletters, we look at conference proceedings, if we look at the kind of reflections which are going on in the field at the time and subsequent to them, you can see that there are strengths and weaknesses to these kinds of shifts in the kind of global architecture for the field. We can see, for example, many environmental educators in the past who were committed to a biocentric or an ecocentric position found that a lot of the sustainable development discourse was very anthropocentric, and that has tended to downplay their contributions to thinking about what's the role and purpose of environmental education and also what the priorities should be. In raising observations like this, the clear thing here is that there is no one right way to thinking about how education and environment are connected together and might be connected, and which are more fruitful types of connections. The kinds of work which has influenced me in thinking about this include Lucy Sauvé's work on currents in environmental education. And I think one of the distinctive features of her work over the years analysing different UN level discourses is to encourage innovation and creativity in the field, not to get locked into a past way of doing things, but to try and work out how we can respond to the needs and challenges that current generations face, and that includes thinking about how inclusive the field is for those kinds of work. So again, if we go back into the deep history of the field, particularly the emergence of environmental education as a concept within education discourse in the late 60s, one of the points which some of the early, we may call them fathers of the field, raised were the distinctions between environmental education, conservation education, and outdoor education. What they determined as a key distinguishing feature for environmental education was this interest in environmental quality and participation in actions which would illustrate environmental citizenship. And within that kind of framework, there is a strong emphasis on lifelong and life-wide learning. It's not just something which happens in schools, but it's something which is about what kind of society do we want to live in. Now, since the 60s and the 70s, there's been a shift in lots of understandings of what it means to be a citizen, when you can become a citizen, what kind of competences you need to be as a citizen. And so we see in things like the Education for Sustainable Development Goals documents from UNESCO in the last few years, and even the Future of Education report, much more of a sense of the importance of developing competencies and capabilities. So in German, that might be Gestaltungskompetence or Futures competence or Action competence. And those focus our attention on what kinds of contributions we can make to society and what kind of society do we want to live in the future. So when we look to some of the models which inform sustainable development, some of the more powerful models here which help environmental educators and link environmental education with sustainable development are those that recognise that the economy depends on ecology. That's a simple way of putting this. Or another popular phrase or slogan, there's no jobs on a dead planet. So thinking about those kinds of things within green skills development, the kind of world of work, what graduates can go into is an important part of this. David Orr is another person whose work I return to a lot because he has a great way of expressing some of the challenges in responding to the question, what is education for? But also, what is education now for? It's not the same as it was in the 60s or the 70s or in diverse parts of the world with different social movements pressing different types of questions, and what we need to think of as we reimagine the field. So David Orr, for example, is one of those people who has helped us think about the fact that it's often the most highly educated people who have the largest ecological footprints, so to speak. And so the types of jobs that universities encourage people to go into or provide them with qualifications in doesn't necessarily help us think through the kinds of ideas from the philosophy of education that Gert Biester has highlighted around the functions of education. Yes, there's credentialisation, but there's also socialisation and subjectification. And those, again, return us to the question of what kind of people do we want to be and how we express things like solidarity with those in a world which is characterised by lots of injustice and lots of pain and suffering because of the environmental conditions that people live within. So if we come full circle, what we're beginning to see here is this central question within environmental education about the importance of environmental quality and how environmental quality is understood in different ways in different communities and might require a recognition of lots of different ways of knowing and understanding those things. So particularly in the last decade or so, we see a lot more emphasis in conferences, in journals, in events, in curriculum documentation, in policies about the importance of recognising Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of knowing, but also the importance of community and understanding how collective senses and distributed capacities become important for the field. This is why I struggle with the focus on individual behaviour change. I worry that focusing on psychological models which emphasise individual change often miss the fact that we live in relationship with others, and those relationships with others may include the modern human world, but other types of affordances that our environments provide. It also allows us to recognise that people are part of our environment too, as well as the non-people part of environments. So whether it's other species, landscapes, the inner scape of our own emotional lives, there can be all sorts of different spaces that we can investigate what kind of environmental education we need to address some of those challenges on environmental quality. So sometimes with environmental quality questions, it can be questions around our ecological consciousness. It can be about the habits and actions that we take. It can be about how we show support and care for others. It can be drawing on other traditions like in disaster education or resilience-focused education, thinking about the notions of help and care and an ethics of care for how we move forwards in our lives, but also the role of schools in particular in developing that. When I think about these kinds of questions, I'm also really heartened by the emphasis over the last 20 years or so on whole school approaches, and thinking about how this is not just what's in a textbook or in a 40-minute lesson or a 50-minute lesson or an excursion, but thinking about how schools as a whole can embrace a particular commitment, a journey towards becoming, for example, more environmentally conscious and aware of some of the challenges the community of the school faces and those in the communities around the school face, and engaging with those in action projects or research projects or inquiry projects, which will make a real difference to the lives and livelihoods of those who are affected by these things. So some other examples of publications I find useful to challenge my thinking include diverse genres of thought and expression like poetry, art. It's important to read things like climate fiction, ecological fiction. There are TV shows. There can be all sorts of different things which encourage us to think differently about people-environment relationships and questions of environmental quality. So sometimes doing that beyond my cultural comfort zone is very important, but also interacting with people from diverse backgrounds and understanding their perspectives and positions in the world, and how I can connect with that and learn from their insights into questions of environmental quality. Within the list of greatest hits for me, if there are questions of who I return to, often there are people who have strongly influenced me in my career that include people like Bill Scott, my PhD supervisor, but also colleagues from the Centre for Research in Education and the Environment, and from there on afterwards, like Stephen Sterling. I find his work particularly inspiring and challenging to make me think about the kind of levels of thinking and levels of thought which have constrained the way we think about environmental quality, but also have encouraged us to think differently about those things. So Stephen Sterling, for example, has written extensively about notions of sustainable education. Bill Scott, for example, has written about ESD1 and ESD2 and the different contrasts between a focus on, say, knowledge and skills and attitudes and behaviours, but also how we think about our frames of mind. So again, I would think of Michael Bonnet's work and Justin Dillon's work, Connie Russell's work, Annette Goff's work. There are many, many scholars I've had the privilege of interacting with and learning from. One of the pleasures of working in an international field is the opportunity to bump into colleagues all over the world. And even last weekend, I had the opportunity to walk in the Yarra Ranges National Park with Martha Monroe. Martha Monroe is a professor from Florida. She was working on a project for the OECD in Pisa, looking at what kinds of science education and the like we need to think about in the Anthropocene. I've learned so much from Martha's work, and just looking at the different ways of thinking about service learning, communication, community-focused projects. So there are many people who we can draw on who inspire us from our generation and the generation above, but also the next generation. And again, I think of the conversations I have with my PhD students and the people who I meet at things like the graduate breakfasts at the NAAE conference, the research symposium there. It's so inspiring to see the passion and the insight that different generations have for the field, but also having the opportunity through something like a research journal for people to set out their position, to argue their case, to test the evidence, to contribute to the field, to see things differently, and hopefully add to the conversation, which has an impact on the way that policy, practice, and the philosophy of environmental education may shift over time, so that it becomes more attuned to these central questions. The Journal of Environmental Education is one of the longest serving journals in the field, and is very well associated with the North American Association for Environmental Education in its early phases. There are many other journals which have emerged over the years, the South African Journal, the Canadian Journal, the Australian Journal. I'm involved with environmental education research, which started in the 1990s. And this is one of those opportunities where when you read across the different journals, these are English-speaking journals, there are journals in other languages too, you realise that there are some central themes that people are interested in. Now, it has to be acknowledged that there's a lot of research which happens which is not funded to the degree that other fields of research in education are funded. So a lot of environmental education research tends to be small scale, modest in ambition and scope, but also trying to make a difference to the kinds of projects that people are working with at that particular time. So when we look at the kind of submissions environmental education research gets, we look to publish over the course of a year about 100 articles. We receive about 500 submissions a year, and those are arranged in lots of different genres and subgenres. We have central questions around teachers' perceptions of environmental issues, students' perceptions of environmental quality, their different understandings of the world around them, so looking at their attitudes, their dispositions, and so on. We also get studies which look at particular innovations in curriculum design. We have studies which are interested in investigating different policy documents and areas of syllabuses, readings, engagement materials, those kinds of things. There can also be studies which reflect on different concepts, so philosophical analysis of the concepts which are involved in the field, and again how those differ in different cultural settings and how we bridge those. One of the questions that some of my students have been engaged with recently, which I've seen appear in journal articles this year, has been a look at what do we mean by interdisciplinarity these days. So if we are expecting students to work with things like the Sustainable Development Goals and not treat those as silos, often there's an expectation of interdisciplinarity. So do we need to be able to master more than one discipline to really do interdisciplinarity well? Is this, again, a question for teams, collective research projects, rather than laying this all on the shoulders or the mind of one particular individual? But also thinking about the touchstones or boundary points. How do we connect different disparate ideas together in meaningful ways? It's very easy to reject papers submitted to environmental education research because, for example, they haven't actually addressed the scope or aims of the journal in terms of, well, what's the education in this? So looking at the kind of interconnectedness of education, environment and sustainability and research are part of the symbol of the journal. If you look at the journal front cover, you look at the logo for the journal, you'll see that we're interested in those interconnections and how they flow into each other and what they mean for each other. So we can learn from many different fields. We can learn from the intersections of those fields, but also how sometimes they amplify different questions and sometimes they detract from different types of questions or innovations which are possible in the field. So as we get into the habit of reading deeply as well as broadly, hopefully that kind of research literacy grows. And we are part of, perhaps we might want to call them reading groups, but we are developing our own understandings and interpretations of the literature and contributing back to that to refine it, to shift it, to challenge perhaps some of the orthodoxies which have emerged over time, some of the voices which tend to dominate, some of those voices which tend to self-cite more than others would perhaps more humbly do so, but also to think about what the next generation wants to focus on within that, recognising too that intergenerational conversations and the boundaries between journals aren't as strict as talking about generations might suggest. So one of the benefits of working in this field in terms of journal editing is most of the journal editors know each other and will happily collaborate together, providing sessions at conferences to early career researchers on how to publish with their particular journal and what we can learn from working together across different journals to find better fits with particular manuscripts. So some journals are very interested in more, say, implied environmental education and communication, and there's a journal with that as the title which focuses on that. Some articles are written which have more of a national or regional audience in mind rather than an international one. So again, sometimes it's good to target a journal which fits the scale of ambition and the intended readership for those particular articles. Other articles tend to fit very well with things like special issues of journals. So an example from environmental education research this year is we have a special issue on humour and environmental education, recognising that sometimes questions of environmental quality seem to be very serious, but perhaps there's a lighter side, or there are different types of pedagogies which we can think through by looking at the role of humour in the field. Some journals are very interested in regional special issues. Environmental education research, for example, tends to try to work with communities of scholars whose work is not necessarily known as well internationally as other areas in the kind of Anglosphere or the more kind of dominant discourses in that. So we try to partner with guest editors who can bring into the spotlight the kind of interesting work which is going on in their community, in their language group, in their region, so that the international literature is enriched by more discussion and debate, and perhaps surprises from the kind of similarities as well as some of the differences we see as we read each other's work in a kind of international space. In terms of some of the tips that we often talk about at the editorial meetings and in the editorial workshops for journals, one of the clear things is to establish, whether it's in the cover letter but also evidenced through the reading, that you are reading the journal you want to submit to. This may sound like a very basic comment, kind of writing 101, but if the citations and the argument are framed as if another journal was in mind or is for another field, then that's a good reason for an editor to question, or where is the contribution to knowledge, the original contribution to this particular community or audience for this journal coming from. So there are questions often raised at the screening process about how is this manuscript establishing itself through the work of the authors to contribute to the conversations and the dialogues and the debates that this particular journal hopes to work with. Within that, there are often simple redirections that are possible. It's not to query the quality of the study or the author's work, but to suggest that sometimes another journal is a better fit. So if, for example, the work is focused very much on early childhood environmental education, there are journals which focus specifically on early childhood environmental education, which might be the best home for that particular work. If it's article which is talking about children, youth and environments, then that might be the journal which is a better fit for that, children, youth and environments. Children's Geographies is another journal where we see work on environmental education appearing, but it's not in a journal with environmental education in the title. You can imagine again that there are lots of different journals which service particular sector needs or different language groups or different communities. There are journals like the ones focused on sustainability in higher education, sustainability in general, the Journal of Education for Sustainable Development. So again, finding a good fit for the manuscript with the right kind of audience that the authors want to engage with becomes a key consideration for any submission. In terms of the kinds of tips for environmental education research, one of the things that we have in the title of our journal is research, and so we're very interested in the kind of quality of thinking about the research design, the methodology, the implications for other research. Other journals may be more interested in reporting on updates on particular ideas or initiatives or conferences, but we are particularly built around the notion of doing high quality research, and so we expect to see detailed thought and reflection on those kinds of things, but also drawing on innovative ideas about doing research. Some journals will focus special issues on particular modes of inquiry. The Journal of Environmental Education has published special issues looking at these kinds of things. The Australian Journal of Environmental Education recently had a special issue on post-human and post-qualitative forms of research. Environmental education research had a double special issue recently looking at new materialisms and environmental education. There are lots of different genres and innovations in research which sometimes need a spotlight or a debate about how do they contribute to the field. So do they lead us into a cul-de-sac, or do they help innovate the work of practitioners, or are they largely for researchers? So sometimes looking at the connections between different spheres is important. Environmental education research published a special issue recently which looked at the links between research and policy, and we see examples of contributions within that journal from people working within the field as insiders, so to speak, as well as contributions from outsiders, kind of looking in, seeing how environmental education researchers could think more differently or deeply around the connections between research and policy. So it's important, again, to read broadly, but also with purpose, and to think about why am I reading this and why am I contributing to a particular set of arguments, and is this debate, for example, current? Is it now stale? Is it something which needs reinvigorating? What's the evidence I can use? What kinds of theories can I use? What kinds of insights from participants can I use, for example, to develop something original as a contribution to the field, which again hopefully brings us back to questions of environmental quality and the role of education within different understandings of that, and how we can perhaps resolve environmental issues or challenges which communities face. So one of the highlights of my career so far has been working with a number of different scholars who are interested in the history of the field and how that's developed. A few years ago, I had the privilege of working with my good friend and colleague Justin Dillon on a project for Routledge which was called The Major Works of Environmental Education. And within that, we were invited to develop 4 volumes of contributions which would form a reference collection for those interested in the history of the field. So you can imagine, in consulting with our colleagues about, well, what would they see as the key readings within the field over the last 50 years or so. We had lots of different ideas and recommendations, but also they tended to cluster into different formats and different genres and different areas. One of the things that Justin and I ended up thinking about was in assembling what became about 169 items, I believe, the kinds of things which are the kind of keys on a piano. We had the major themes and the minor themes, the major chords and the minor chords, which we played around with as different notions. And again, if you read across the different sections within that major works collection, you can see how some ideas spiral through decades worth of research. If you take as an example of that, the importance of urban environmental education, we see that in the early 70s in environmental education as a journal, which became the Journal of Environmental Education. Some of the earliest comments about the field were to recognise that most young people do their schooling within an urban environment. So being able to walk outdoors from the schoolyard into the local community and tackle environmental quality questions, which is relevant to where they live, has been a central theme throughout the field. And we see that right through to more recent connections and the interest in that kind of work, that things like Urban Environmental Education Review. And the fascinating thing there, which I think cements that kind of level of interest, is how collections like that have been so widely translated and engaged with in different communities around the world. So that common thread of environmental education in the city, environmental education in suburbs, thinking about questions of environmental quality, street work as well as field work, for example. These kinds of things are recurring themes. Another consideration in looking at the kind of reference collections within the field, I remember having a conversation once with Annette Goff where we talked about the ghosts of environmental education. Some ideas continue to haunt us. Some perhaps need exercising. I'm currently in Korea, and I know that there are genres here which emphasise the role of zombies. Sometimes there are zombie ideas which seem to never be able to die and are always coming back to bite us. Sometimes those are particular individuals with their perspectives on the world, but sometimes it can be particular conceptions of how education and environment are connected together. So as a recurring theme throughout much of the international dialogue on this has been whether environmental management is the best frame. Is it still about people controlling the environment, people trying to manage something which is perhaps beyond their control? I think as one of the ways of exercising that kind of perspective, we can turn to ideas from the field of, or emerging field of, wild pedagogies. So the wildness of nature, human nature, the things which can't be constrained or controlled, engaging with things which are kind of beyond our comprehension or understanding, being open to that and being committed to a sense of humility to what's going on in terms of planetary systems, planetary boundaries, wicked problems. All of these things would suggest sometimes that an environmental management focus is often inadequate for dealing with some of the super complex problems that we face now. So yes, sometimes those kind of zombie ideas can be important to recognise, but also to think how we deal with those. And again, there are many other zombies and strange creatures which fit through this particular area. One of the other highlights of my career so far has been my involvement in editing a series for Palgrave on studies in education and environment, and there have been some fantastic contributions to that series which have really made me sit back and think, I wish I'd thought of that, but also that really helps us think differently. There was the first book within the series was edited by Bob Jickling and Stephen Sterling, and that was on post-sustainability and environmental education. And that collection provided some really challenging perspectives to the kind of narrowing of discourse and the risk of totalitarian thought, so to speak, within some of the UN documentation and shifts towards whether it was the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development or more recently the Sustainable Development Goals and 4.7 on education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. Another interesting collection which was contributed to that series was focused on animals in environmental education, and thinking again about the role of animals, the human animal, but also other than human animals, and how we think about our relationships with them as part of questions of environmental quality. So it comes down to even simple things like who are the companions in our home, in our garden, in our communities, but also our diets. What do we focus on there, and whether things like our diet is a space for thinking about environmental education, but also broader questions which might be in contemporary consideration, planetary health, resilience, but also the ethics and morality of being in dominant relationships with other species, and what environmental educators can do to raise questions and pose inquiries for students to begin to engage with those aspects, because we all eat probably multiple times a day, and thinking about those parts of our lifestyle and our livelihoods and the kinds of networks and systems behind that can be an interesting space for those kinds of considerations. Another fascinating contribution to the Palgrave series was a connection on what was termed dark pedagogy. So sometimes thinking about the kind of prospect of there is no future, which doesn't seem to be apocalyptic in the popular imagination. As we deal with things like the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, we've had the pandemic, a lot of our vision of the future is shaped by very dark visions. And so how does pedagogy respond to that? So the contributions and reflections in that collection are fascinating ways of thinking about environmental education and things like death, but also the ironies of trying to sustain a system which perhaps needs to collapse. Or does it? There are all of these kinds of questions which environmental educators can engage with. And I think this is where the role of scholarship is really important, so we can begin to push back on narratives which might suggest that it's either one thing or the other. It's extremes, that there's no middle ground. So reading these kinds of texts can help us really develop a more nuanced understanding of what's going on, and perhaps expose us to ideas which we hadn't thought of or hadn't engaged with or were unfamiliar with because they come from different parts of the world, aren't part of our cultural literacy. This can really help us shift and innovate within the field by engaging with those ideas. A consistent theme within the archives of the field is the importance of investing in educators and treating them as competent and capable people with brains, with hearts, with the capability of making a difference. So as a practitioner, as an educator, feeding your mind, feeding your heart, feeding your soul through engaging with high quality ideas, high quality individuals, people who will demonstrate that the company you keep within the field is going to help move you forwards, are kinds of central themes that you will find within the archives on the role of professional development and professional preparation initially within this field. We know that not everybody who does a major or a minor in environmental education goes into the field, but we know that there are many who find the field after they have become an educator in another area because they realise that they are dissatisfied with the way that the curriculum or assessment or pedagogy or school systems are going. And so to be able to provide a space of connection where people can challenge the way education is going, the general tenor of schooling, the kind of challenges schools face in many parts of the world in terms of funding or being underfunded, the working conditions, all of these kinds of things are central questions for educators, but also for environmental educators in reclaiming a space to keep questions of environmental quality at the centre of schooling and of education. What you study, what you learn about in a primary school is often different from a secondary school, high school situation, from colleges, from universities, in formal and informal learning. Finding others who are on the same journey, who you can learn from, who you can work with, who can inspire you, challenge you, all of these kinds of things are important questions and considerations for maintaining a vibrant professional culture and providing growth and challenge over a career, hopefully, which leads to the resolution of some of those challenges of environmental quality, which we can experience in our daily lives, but also we are aware of throughout the world through things like the Sustainable Development Goals. They highlight many of the challenges that we face. So finding ways of engaging with that within initial teacher education, within ongoing professional development, within professional associations, within unions, within our own friendship circles, within our critical friends groups. There are lots of different spaces that we can engage with to keep us sharp, to keep us honest, to keep us accountable in the kind of work that we do, but also to inspire us to be creative individuals who make a difference in the world.
So, Alan, should environmental education be viewed as one field or a collection of different fields?
That's a good question, Alex. I think one of the challenges is to recognise that a field often draws on many other disciplinary areas to make its oneness, so to speak. So when we talk about one field, we're not talking about physics, chemistry, biology, the arts, the humanities, but the bridging point which connects them together, the kind of stepping stones which allow us to focus on different questions of environmental quality, environmental improvement, become really important for establishing what is the one field. So we can think of the roots of the field, which were often in things like conservation education, outdoor education, connections with other areas, and trying to bring those to a oneness. Again, conservation might draw on conservation biology, cultural studies, the history of a place, but it doesn't necessarily have the same interest in questions of resolving environmental challenges. So the oneness comes from a number of different sources, but it's not trying to repeat school subject disciplines in the same way that other fields might try to do. Particularly the connection between, say, university and research areas, which form the kind of knowledge base for a field, with the kinds of emphases which you might have in different forms of education. So if you're studying physics, for example, experiential education, doing nuclear physics doesn't mean you have to go inside a nuclear reactor, but it would give you a sense of education in a different sphere if you were able to use different modes and approaches. So with environmental education, I think one of the challenges there is working out what's the best combination of things which would help people address appropriate questions and challenges for their communities, but also perhaps with a view to not just the present generation, but to future generations. Like with things like sustainable development, there is a challenge there around intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. So what is it that we're doing which enables others to live better and well, but without ruining the chances or destroying the habitats or the ecosystems for future generations? And that again might be where the unifying questions come from. If we focus our attention on different dimensions to that, not that there's only one way of thinking about those kinds of questions, but drawing on different perspectives from different cultures, from different histories, from different senses of what's a priority for the moment, we can begin to unpack those things. And in this particular decade, we're aware that the Sustainable Development Goals might be one of those things which gives us different areas to consider.
If we didn't have environmental problems at all, would we need environmental education?
It's an important question, because environmental education to me is always oriented outside of itself. It has to be engaging with communities and what their challenges are. So it's not studying a topic for the sake of studying a topic and an inward-looking discipline. It's actually interested in engaging people in the worlds they live and engaging them in ways which make sense to them. So there's always going to be a strong commitment to re-energizing and renewing the field by understanding where people are now, what it is that concerns them in relation to environmental topics, which perhaps previous generations thought differently about. So the challenges of the past are not necessarily the challenges of today, and won't necessarily be the challenges of the future. And in this way, the field can renew itself, so to speak, by consulting people, finding out what challenges they face, and then using things like democratic processes, participatory learning, action projects to begin to develop that sense of, well, what does environmental quality mean to us? How do we resolve differences of opinion around that, differences of experiences, different structural challenges, which mean that some people are affected more by environmental challenges than others? How people protect themselves, how people show solidarity and empathy. And to me, this is why environmental education is more than just environmental training or behaviour change, because it's engaging people's questions of their values, their worldviews, who they see themselves as people, as individuals, as different subgroups, as with particular identities. And again, those will change over time as people grow, understand things anew or in different ways, engage different aspects of learning, so skills development, values development, action competencies, all sorts of different things depending on the environmental topic or challenge or issue or question of quality which they are engaging with.
It seems like environmental education can be used sort of as a tool for us to learn how to live as a society, how to function as a large group of people, to practice democracy, to practice civic skills.
Yes, I think that you're onto something there, Alex, and I think that's why groups like the UN have a great way of expressing things in their reports, like education for the world we want. Now, it's not clear exactly what that is, but asking the question of people, well, what kind of world do you want? What kind of future do you want to live in? Who is that going to benefit? Who is going to be impinged on by negative aspects of those things? Is the current way that we live on this planet, for example, fair for everybody? And those kinds of questions bring all sorts of different educational challenges for people. again, sometimes it will be to draw on things which you learn in school, things that you can learn outside of school when you are exposed to different environmental conditions. Going to different places may spark new insights, challenges, realizing that sometimes we actually have to unlearn certain things before we can learn new things. So again, it puts a lot of pressure on us to think about, well, what should education be for now? It's not necessarily the same as it was 20, 30, 50 years ago, and it's likely to change into the future. So having a vibrant community of environmental educators who can keep responding to these things, understanding that the kinds of challenges communities face evolve over time, sometimes abruptly, sometimes in slow ways, sometimes in ways which are unseen. Those kinds of things to me are what keep questions alive, but also require us to do more research, evaluation, innovation, new thinking, broadening the sphere of people who are involved so that we can learn from each other. And I think when we're engaging with these kinds of questions, we have to really be aware that there are likely to be people who are more expert than us, who have a different understanding which we haven't tapped before, who can help us think in new ways about the value of education and what education should focus on. And again, we have many years now of scholarship in this field which have explored those questions. So having conversations with contemporary authors, researchers, activists, practitioners, bringing that into conversation with the next generation, anticipating where we might go, can be really important. I think one of the things which has really struck a lot of people in the last few years has been, how do you respond to things like the COVID pandemic? Lots of things that we took for granted in environmental education, which have become kind of the orthodoxy, were no longer possible. Outdoor education, for example, experiential learning. Doing environmental education through Zoom is not natural for a lot of people who have been working in the field. So again, that might drive some kind of change, asking questions about what is really important within the field and what do we need to perhaps let go of, use to change and innovate to address new conditions for education, for schooling, and new understandings of the future of education and what it should be about. So again, that kind of churn of ideas, churn of practices, churn of perhaps policy, the infrastructure for what we need to in order to support this kind of work becomes really important. I think that's important, Alex, because some fields very much improvised in effect by the practitioners within the field. There's no overarching structure which determines what you must do. So if you think of language learning, for example, yes, it might be that proficiency in a language is important, but it's not decided by, for example, a UN body, what is important in those settings or with those kind of considerations in mind. With questions of environmental quality, we know that there's lots of research going on which looks at the state of the planet, for example, and what's happening in different communities. And be able to tap into those kinds of directions and looking at, so what are different international research organisations, political organisations, governments interested in for the health of their communities? Those become important. And I think that again is where the challenge is around how do we modify the field. Some of that will require an understanding of the different frameworks and drivers of these kinds of initiatives. So within the research sphere on current climate challenges, we have an opportunity to think about, well, what does the research say about the challenges different societies face in addressing climate injustice? And that might come from IPCC reports, it might come from COP meetings, but there is a question there about, well, what's the role of education in increasing and improving people's understandings, their skill set, their capacity to address some of these challenges, to deal with things like eco-anxiety or climate anxiety. There will be an educational dimension to that, and also how our organisations might need to learn too. So environmental education might not mean what goes on in a school classroom setting. It might be to think differently about environmental education and the different types of organisations which might need to be involved in that. So the business sector, the finance sector, we know accounting, for example, has to think about risk all of the time, and climate risk is a big driver there. So how we educate our professionals is a form of environmental education. It might also be that people aren't being educated in their profession at the moment, so they have an inadequate environmental education.
What you just mentioned, it reminds me that environmental education, or at least most of environmental education that we discuss at conferences and workshops, is with children in schools or their age, but adults are excluded for the most part. Is it a problem?
Yeah, it's a problem to me, and I think one of the key challenges is it's a kind of betrayal of the roots of the field, because in all of the foundational documents there is an expectation that it's about lifelong learning and life-wide learning. Environmental citizenry is a goal. Environmental education will build the capacities of young people and adults and older generations to keep investigating these questions. So in effect, the audience for environmental education is not just the school-age kids at a current time, it's the whole planet, it's the whole population. And that is an immense, diverse, ever-changing body of people who can engage with environmental questions. So learning from your elders, learning from those who have experienced things before, can be part of the intergenerational dialogue within environmental education. Those who think they know how to do things can also learn from the next generation about, well, what are they concerned about in relation to these things. And so in that way, yes, at one level, it's perhaps easier to focus on the school setting because everybody goes to school at some point or another. That's the hope, that's what universal education is about. But we keep learning throughout our whole lives, or at least I hope we do, because that's what keeps us alive. And it's those kinds of things where understanding that perhaps what we learnt at school may not be as relevant to different phases of our lives means that we might need to think very differently about what kind of environmental education we need there. So a good example of this to me is how we use different sites beyond the classroom. We have informal classrooms which might be parks, museums, gardens, etc. But they would have a different dynamic of people who would engage there and learn there. And for me, for example, family or community forms of environmental education can be really important. I think you've raised a really important question about, well, what might be some of the barriers to that? And again, is environmental education, for example, coded to fit with the lifestyles of certain segments of society? So there are criticisms of things like perhaps sometimes how white environmental education can be, or is it very middle class? But as with this point about the whole population of the planet being involved, then unless it's opened up to looking at questions for all, then that becomes important. So it may be that we focus on questions of environmental injustice, but another flip side of that question is the 1%. What kind of environmental education do they get? Which means asking hard questions about how do you learn to live in the world as if you can have the biggest ecological footprint, or run companies which create the most damage, or extract profit in a way which damages so many others. If we could change, for example, the education of the 1%, perhaps that would have a different kind of effect than focusing on other parts of the demographic profile. And I think there, again, trying to work out, well, what would be some of the things which would be missing from the way we talk about environmental education. It's not to posit the rich, but perhaps it's a way of challenging the rich to think about, well, what is your responsibility in addressing questions of environmental quality? So with the 1%, one of the things which we can see as a kind of heartening sign at the moment is the super rich beginning to divest of some of their super wealth. And if that kind of money philanthropic funding, etc., can find its way into supporting better forms of education, which again help communities wrestle with some of the challenges which they faced in environmental quality, then we can begin to see some signs of change there. A lot of the wealth that is generated on the planet gets locked up and doesn't support the ecological system which generates the economy. And so changing the perspective on that, beginning to release some of that, redirect it towards much better ends, also then helps us do things like generate the opportunity for people to live in the world that they want to live in, which demonstrates solidarity, addressing questions of justice, but also improving the ecological, environmental conditions that different people face. So I think we are in interesting times, as they say.
A lot of things that you're talking about is more sort of institutional change, but most of environmental education, at least we think, like on the surface, it's about individual change, whether behavioral attitudes or knowledge. Is there a conflict? Should we reform environmental education and direct it more towards institutional change?
There's certainly a tension, and I can see exactly why a lot of people get frustrated with environmental education if it only appears to be focusing on things like individual behaviour change. And the criticism on that front can be from both the educational side, when is that really educational, but also what are people learning. So if you're not understanding how the world works, how power operates, how certain conditions tend to be reproduced, which create environmental challenges in the first place, then that doesn't sound like a good form of environmental education. Again, another take on that is also to ask questions around what kinds of priorities do people learn about in school. So one of the most famous papers for me within environmental education research is one that John Huckle and Ariane Vals wrote about the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. And their criticism of a lot of the work that UNESCO was sponsoring in that decade was that it was not challenging business as usual to the degree that it could. So if you're a conservative, for example, you may say that, well, it's not good education simply because you don't see lots of different perspectives, the kind of two sides of the argument. But sometimes there are pushbacks to those kinds of questions where, well, what does the science say? What counts as two sides of an argument? You think of, say, the smoking debate. It's, yes, people's choice if they want to smoke, but that doesn't mean that they should ignore the science of what are the likely effects, what are the probabilities of having a lifestyle which includes smoking. Others would criticise environmental education for not going far enough. They would say it still sounds too much like the status quo. It's still constrained by what goes on in schools and the priorities of schooling. If schools are geared largely to developing the next generation of workers in society, giving people qualifications, socialising them into the norms of society, perhaps it should be more radical. Perhaps it needs to challenge some of those things to bring about the changes which fulfill that kind of desire for living in a better world.
And interestingly, schools, testing, etc., it is focused on individual changes and individual knowledge, maybe not even behavior, but mostly knowledge. We don't test in schools children's ability to function together as a community or to question social norms.
Yes. The common criticism from the world of work, in effect, of education systems is individual assessment is not the reality of adult life. We are judged by the performance of the teams we're in, how we solve problems, how we think differently, how we create innovation. We could say that environmental education needs the same kinds of learning outcomes and assessments. So focusing on individualized understanding of things will get you so far, but not far enough. And I think that's where things like innovation in evaluation and assessment regimes becomes really important. It's fascinating to me how, for example, the OECD and PISA tests are assessing things like young people's understanding of what it means to live in the Anthropocene these days. It's early days for the thinking through of what needs to be understood by that. But hopefully over the next few years we will see much more of an attention within schools on thinking about, well, what kind of world are people inheriting, and what kind of work will we need to be able to do. And if that's in conventional forms, that's one side of it, but it might also mean that it needs to be radically transformed too. So again, thinking about the different ways within communities that we value certain ways of representing outcome and success and wealth. Wealth might be inner wealth as much as how many dollars you have. Wealth might be about the range of friendships, the understanding of the ecology around you, the kinds of food you eat and celebrate, the kinds of events, cultural, spiritual, etc., which become important to people's lives. And I think in understanding that environmental education can also address those kinds of questions, it can also help us move away from simplistic notions like environmental education is about recycling, as if recycling was the solution for everything. One of the central challenges with how we define environmental education is how much emphasis we put on notions like environmental literacy. So we're in this beautiful reclaimed space at the moment, but how we read and how we in effect write this place is about our environmental literacy, what we can recognise in the space around us, the history of this. So one component of environmental literacy might be the basic, what Andrew Stables calls functional environmental literacy. So we might need to understand the different components of the habitats, the species, the way the land is used, who feels safe here, who uses the space for particular purposes, and so on. As we walk along the street, we see families, we see children, we see people running, we see all sorts of different potential uses of a space like this. But what kind of environmental learning might happen here is not just constrained by the particular current uses. There could be other things which happen here. If we think about the role of the humanities, the arts, the social sciences in environmental literacy, this is a site which, as well as measuring environmental qualities like water pollution or species diversity, could be used for celebrations. It could be used for community events. It could be used for dramatic performance. It could be used for historical reenactments. It could be used in lots of different ways, which would still contribute something different to people's environmental literacy. And I think that's where, with Andrew Stables' work, he talked about the importance of cultural environmental literacy. So again, we are in Korea. The significance of a river in Korea might be different from the country I was born in England, from Russia where you were born. It's a very different sense of, say, how do water landscapes and waterscapes emerge, are valued by cultural traditions and so on. But again, with Andrew Stables' work, he emphasised critical environmental literacies. And I think with those kinds of considerations, the history of this river in the last 20, 30 years is a good example of why a critical perspective is important to our understanding of environmental education. And in that particular situation, the restoration of this river was an example of how activist groups, community groups were able to work together to challenge government about the clearances which had happened here from the kind of old shantytown version, but also thinking about what kind of message this sent about how the city valued ecology, how it valued different aspects of its environmental history and how it could be changed. So as we look around, we can see murals, we can see plaques, we can see explanation boards, we can see people strolling, enjoying this place. If this was still a freeway, none of that could have happened. So critiquing how society organises space, organises its environment, thinks about environmental quality, all of these things help us to think, well, where is the critical environmental literacy, for example, which happens within school, but also beyond school. Again, this space is one of multiple generations of different users and can be seen as a space which emphasises that lifelong learning and life-wide learning around environmental quality can continue and happen.
And get into practical stuff. Should environmental education be a science subject in school, or part of social studies, or art, or maybe philosophy, or all of it? And if all of it, how do we find time in all of the subjects to cover environmental topics?
I think with a question like that, it's one of those unanswerable questions where the grammar and the vocabulary of schooling is so important for the spaces for environmental education to happen. There are scholars, some might say provocateurs, who would say, like Anthony Weston did in the Canadian Journal of Environmental Education, what we really need to think of is de-schooling environmental education.
De-schooling environmental education.
Yes, so taking it out of just the remit of the school and focusing on, say, environmental literacy, which can be learnt through different school subjects, through different school events, through excursions, through residentials, through community partnerships. That isn't the only space for doing that. And if environmental education becomes solely associated with a school setting, then we kind of discount the opportunities which might happen in lots of other areas. You mentioned environmental philosophy, the arts, the sciences. Sure, all of those things can contribute to environmental education and will be important ingredients to that. But what the individual learner needs is going to change and will differ immensely depending on all sorts of factors. So consulting the learner with what they need to learn about environmental quality and how that might be built, how that might change at different points in their life becomes important. If learners see themselves as being environmentally educated over time, as lifelong learners, as people who will engage different forms of environmental education in formal, non-formal, informal settings, for example, in short bursts over the long duration. They will have epiphanies at different points in their lives about the significance of environments, how we engage with them, people-environment relationships. All of these things will mean that we will have unique ways of thinking about how to construct environmental education, how to develop environmental education, how to evaluate environmental education, how to make it more appropriate, better suited, more innovative for current and future generations.
Well, since you mentioned the idea of de-schooling environmental education, I wonder if it will make sense to de-school literacy and numeracy and lots of other subjects. And I'm not saying like completely de-school and take it outside of school, but make it a little bit maybe closer to life.
I think this is where people are already expecting that. People know that literacy has been transformed by social media. The way that we think about literacy now is not the way we thought about literacy 10, 20, 50, 100 years ago. And it will be the same with our kind of environmental experiences. If they are largely governed by screens, for example, that may limit our view of the world and the range of experiences we have at different places. So being able to engage with questions of technology, of mediation, again, this is where environmental education can bridge and draw on lots of different areas. So critical media literacy is just as important to environmental education as scientific literacy. It's just as important as climate literacy. It's just as important as ecological literacy. These literacies come together in unique ways when they're focused on questions of environmental quality.
Environmental education more recently has focused a lot on climate change. I wonder whether this conversation and attention to climate change has overshadowed other important concerns, social or ecological, that we need to pay more attention to in environmental education.
The focus on climate change is a good example of where educators have been listening to particularly young people about what concerns them in terms of questions of environmental quality. So to me, it's not a surprise that a lot of environmental educators are embracing climate as a topic, which allows them to engage young people and in projects, in learning with them about how we can begin to address significant global challenges which might have local manifestations or require solidarity with people who are struggling with climate injustice, climate damage, climate challenges which are likely to affect many more people in different ways, particularly as temperatures rise, as sea levels rise, as biodiversity losses increase, and so on. So being able to understand those system connections, being able to understand how things which resonate with individuals in terms of important life expectations, the kind of collapsing in of what people understand the future to be, those kinds of things are important for environmental educators to address and not ignore. But it can neither be to the exclusion of other areas which have been really important within environmental education. So understanding how, for example, a sense of place might change because of the way climate will impact that place can be a bridging point, but it's not that it can only be understood through a climate lens. So understanding different aspects of the history of the field which bring us to closer attention to those enduring issues of environmental quality, environmental improvement, taking civic action, being an environmental citizen, understanding where your capabilities are, how your efficacy to bring about change will rely on collaborating with others, negotiating problems, bringing about change. All of those kinds of things, yes, can be also used within a climate context, but they can also be used in other settings for environmental education provision.
Alan, let's talk about the journal Environmental Education Research. I wonder what makes a good special issue.
A good special issue is one that meets a need within the field. So perhaps draws attention to an area which is not studied in depth or with breadth and with innovation in mind. So sometimes we have original articles which are standalone, and it would be good to hear how others are researching a similar topic or using a similar technique, or how different findings relate to that area. So that might be the start of an idea for a special issue. Environmental Education Research as a journal has published a lot of special issues which focus on drawing attention to research carried out in countries or in situations where they're not necessarily part of the minority world. So the Anglosphere tends to dominate a lot of the international discourse on environmental education research. So we are committed to working with different associations, research groups, to try and bring research which may not be published in English to the attention of an English-speaking audience. So a good special issue which focuses on a region may be one which draws on the history of the field, the research projects which have happened there, identifies what is distinctive about research in that area, and also how it compares with similar kinds of studies from around the world. And those might show something of the unique characteristics of research, or the conditions for doing research, or the findings of research in a particular place. but may also enrich the wider international discourse on those topics by bringing into the international conversation perspectives which may not be so well known or may have been overlooked because they are not normally published in English. A good example of this would be we published a special issue looking at Danish and Swedish environmental and sustainability education, and looking at the traditions around democracy, action competence, and perspectives from European traditions are important to fix some of the biases perhaps, or address some of the biases where those who would not be familiar with those can begin to engage with them. Similar kinds of things happened when we had a special issue from the Benelux region, so looking at the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. If you ask people to name a researcher from Belgium or the Netherlands or Luxembourg, it may be the same names which come up, but by drawing a special issue together where the guest editors can bring in the work of research students, early career researchers, perhaps people not yet so well known internationally, that can be a good way of redressing the balance on that. We're interested in also working with communities of researchers who may not have necessarily the resources to develop a special issue, so we offer mentoring and leadership and support and development of those using the editorial board and the expertise of members of the editorial board to help begin to develop those. So it's a great opportunity to think about how to engage international researchers with comments and perspectives and findings and histories from around the world and bring that to their attention. Some of the special issues which have been developed for environmental education research have tried to address a blind spot in the field, and in one of the editorials that I wrote with the previous editor of the journal, Bill Scott, we talked about different blind spots, blank spots, bright spots, bald spots within the field. So sometimes the people who are invited by the guest editors or using an open call are trying to work out what the different spots are within the field, and so a paper which addresses a particular spot can be a helpful way of thinking about, is this going to make a contribution to the field, and in particular an original contribution to the field. An example of that would be a couple of years ago we saw the development of a special issue on new materialisms and environmental education, and that was very well received by the prospective manuscript authors. So rather than just one special issue, we were able to publish a double special issue representing a much broader international range of scholarship, engaging with different forms of new materialism and also critiquing some of those forms of new materialism. So hopefully adding something back to the wider discourse on new materialisms. We are planning to publish a special issue in 2023 which looks at humour and environmental education. Now, some people may think that it's no laughing matter to think about some of the challenges around the environment and the ecological crisis or the climate crisis, but that has been a blind spot in effect in the field, and the special issue editors for that collection have sourced a range of really interesting papers which have looked at things like the role of humour, irony, self-deprecation, all sorts of things which also fit in with different genres of humour from around the world, and draw on humour studies as well, and how that might innovate pedagogies but also influence what we research. So rather than necessarily deal with, say, pessimism or with anxiety, there may be other things which need to be addressed in relation to environmental education to move the field forwards, and that might be to look at some of these, again, bright spots. What might we learn from those kinds of new types of inquiry, new types of question, new areas of focus which will innovate the field?
What strategies should research journals use to attract submissions, important submissions from countries and from voices that are underrepresented?
One of the challenges for many journals is how well they can reflect the funding conditions, the research programs, the work of research councils, other sources of funding for research in what is they are able to publish. So if you come from a relatively wealthy country, you may have multi-million-dollar grants that you can generate many outputs from. Those can tend to dominate what people think is research and also squeeze out the space for others. So sometimes, just as we want others to step up, sometimes in research we need others to step back to make space for others to be able to have their research published. Some types of research are very financially intensive and require lots of different forms of collaboration to produce data and analyze the data to produce findings. Other forms of research are very resource unintensive. So scholarship which may work with historical documents, may be more philosophical in approach, conceptual inquiry, discussion-based types of research, for example, do not necessarily need as much research resourcing behind them. The key considerations for having a paper accepted in a journal are to do with the criteria for review, not necessarily who the author is or where they come from. So in addressing the kinds of challenges that journals face in drawing on publications from around the world, it's important to keep the criteria for refereeing up to date, the aims and scope as inclusive as possible, and ways of supporting others through the work of the publishers, learned societies, local networks of researchers, mentoring and supervision can help develop people's capacities to publish high quality research and develop high quality manuscripts along the way to that. So when we review papers, we still are very interested in having double-blind review, because we don't want the refereeing process to be influenced by an understanding of who the author is or where they're from. We want them to be treated as on a level playing field with those who perhaps have more advantage built into the system. So again, sometimes editorial board members will provide more detailed feedback and support where there may be a need to provide that kind of thing. Having said that, there are many fantastic papers we get from all around the world. We have submissions from 40, 50 countries usually every single year. The quality of manuscript preparation is improving year on year, and sometimes it's not as much as an issue that people might be told that it is. So we're finding that particularly in most issues of the journal, if there is a paper from the same country twice, that is a rare thing these days. Most of the papers that we publish will represent a wide variety of research traditions, research contexts, research questions. So as we say in the journal editorial blurb, we are open to studies from a range of schools of inquiry, different traditions, different ways of conducting research, and different forms of output.
In the journal Environmental Education Research, you receive submissions, articles that cover a wide range of topics and methods. I wonder if you notice that something really interesting is going on that might lead to sort of scientific revolution and paradigm shift in environmental education.
I think it's hard to say depending on the types of submissions that you receive, particularly if the submission looks like it's very inward focused. But when you see manuscripts which try to engage a wide range of conversations going on in research, you can see signs that some types of question are being asked more intensely or in a different way than they were before. Some are beginning to not be as fashionable or as interesting as perhaps previous decades of research tended to focus on. A good example of that to me would be how different forms of capital are a common area of interest in the social sciences. So whether it's cultural capital or social capital, that was popular for some researchers 10, 15 years ago, but people have started rethinking what is the focus on capital and have perhaps started shifting to other C words like capabilities, competencies, community, and they're beginning to shift in terms of where their focus is. Whether it be called a paradigm shift, I don't know, but I think one of the recurring themes in our conversation has been the move away from individualizing to looking at context and how individuals are shaped by a context which includes others, and those others might be increasingly understood as things from the more than human world. So shifting away from, say, an anthropocentric perspective in research and in the types of questions we ask and pursue, to thinking about a more than anthropocentric view of the world. And that again allows us to think about different epistemologies, different methodologies, different ontologies, different axiologies in our research. So the kinds of knowledge we create, the way we understand being in the world and becoming in the world, the kinds of ways of generating knowledge, but also the kind of values which underpin the kinds of questions we pursue in research. So if we shift more towards, say, a relational ontology, then in research we're often interested in co-producing knowledge, not necessarily doing research on people or simply research with people, but a kind of research by and through and for more than just people. So bringing in different kinds of values, ethics, morals into the equation for how we design our research, how we prosecute our research, how we report our research, who we feel our research is accountable to. In considering these kinds of elements, you can imagine that research infrastructures, whether it's in the training of researchers, the types of grant priorities that funding councils have, those also have a very strong influence on what people see as the kind of dominant ways of doing research and perhaps some of the more marginal ones. Within environmental education as a field of inquiry, you often find that things like journals, environmental education research, Journal of Environmental Education, the list goes on, but a lot of the publications come from, say, doctoral studies, whereas in other fields the infrastructure, the body of researchers, the workforce is structured differently. So again, you see a reflection of the kinds of interests at different stages in career which come from that, but also the different structures of careers across different areas of educational inquiry. One of the things which I find is increasingly happening within submissions is much more of a sense of collaborative writing and asking questions around authorship. So who has actually authored the work is one of those recurring questions that publication ethics asks us to address. Who contributes to the work, but also who is responsible for dealing with the outcomes and acting on those outcomes. So sometimes including, say, some of the participants in the authoring team, but also just not necessarily defaulting to adding a professor's name to a paper, because they may not have actually written any of the paper or helped with the construction of it. It's just because it's from their lab. So asking questions around who actually authors work and whose voice is represented in that work and who is responsible and accountable for that work is one of the shifts I began to see in the types of submissions we receive. And then again in the way we credit our work. So using things like credit statements, the tensing model or the tensing approaches which get us to think carefully about who has contributed what to a paper. Those are some of the shifts in the culture of publication of scholarly work these days, which I think it will be interesting to see how that shifts in the future.
How do research participants, such as community member, benefit by being co-authors of papers, and not only co-authors when their name is on a paper, but actually participating in research?
If a research design has involved the co-production of knowledge, then for some people it's only fair that they are included in the account of the research. And in previous times there would be a strong emphasis on things like member checking. So if you have invested time, energy, thought into helping construct the findings of a study, then it's fair to expect recognition of that kind of work. So a senior academic writing on behalf of others as if they had no voice sounds a bit odd these days. So finding ways to recognize the contributions is really important, and that is increasingly challenging when teams of researchers may include people who are salaried to do research, as well as volunteer their time to produce data, or maybe largely invisible from the research process. So those who have perhaps processed or prepared the data, those who have worked on the research ethics at a university committee, the librarians who have tracked down the materials which people have done a literature review on. There are lots of potential people who could be acknowledged as contributors to a study, but also asking the question, well, what constitutes authorship these days? One of the key qualities of epistemic virtue discussions within research is that sense of humility, citing other people's work carefully to recognize where work comes from, but also being open to the influence of others in shaping your thinking about a topic. So again, avoiding things like over self-citation, engaging in public forums to test your ideas, like through conferences and workshops, being open to other considerations around the range of ideas and who has authored those ideas that someone engages with. So perhaps like with site club ideas, perhaps drawing on those whose work is historically marginalized. So a lot of feminist researchers, for example, will try to address male bias within the field by citing carefully from those whose voices or experiences or insights overlooked or have been marginalized deliberately. So beginning to change the dynamic of the kind of intellectual work which is produced and again provides an original contribution to knowledge. So a robust review process is really important for encouraging people to reflect on where their ideas have come from and if they are oversighting themselves, for example. So it's a responsibility of editorial boards and editors to address those kinds of concerns, but also to hopefully encourage those who like, dare I say, the sound of their own voice, or feel like they have a megaphone, or feel like they have something to say to the exclusion of others, to reflect on their kind of positioning and how they position others within the field. So again, with publishing ethics, I think it's important to keep discussing that within research communities, to actively engage with the research community and listen to others and get feedback about why, for example, those who cite the work may be from a particular group or reflect a particular background, and how ideas are engaged across diverse genres, diverse groups, are valued in different ways by different research communities or users of research.
It seems like citing different works is almost like engaging in a dialogue with different researchers. So if you cite just yourself, it's talking to yourself.
I think you're exactly right, Alex, and I think that's where concerns around monologuing are important, but I really like the use of the word dialogue. If we see journals as there to serve a community, to record the inquiries that are happening in a diverse research community, then what you are trying to do is contribute something original to an ongoing conversation, which will change over time, which will be renewed by new voices, and particularly in spaces where people feel welcome to contribute. If a journal gives the impression that you have to follow a particular school or line or hold to a certain position, then that is where journals can look like closed shops or have a particular strong position on things which excludes or downgrades or denigrates other people's views. In a journal like Environmental Education Research, because of the volume of publications, we hope we never give that impression. 100 articles a year, for example, are never going to be all saying the same thing. So encouraging people to read within the journal, but also beyond the journal, bring in new perspectives from other places, challenge people within the field, challenge established positions in research, perspectives on research, findings from research. That is what renews a scholarly field. The ethics of appreciating other people's work is not something which all doctoral training programs, for example, encourage us to engage. The publishers of many high quality journals these days give guidance on reviewing. And I think the shift that we have seen in those templates and guides and training opportunities within reviewing are good at modeling a kind of appreciation of others' work, and also shifting the focus of attention in refereeing towards a more formative form of conversation with the author, rather than what might be seen as a judgmental or summative view, where people are given the impression when they receive a letter from an editor that the referees just didn't like their work and want to shout that at them. So shifting the tone, shifting the forms of appreciation, the kind of formative feedback which can come is something which we can learn together. And I know with environmental education research, for example, it's fantastic to see the next generation of early career researchers modeling some of the most positive ways of engaging with research. And I think that one of the key characteristics is a lot of early career and next generation researchers imagine giving feedback in person to someone. If you imagine that you were talking to that person face to face, what would you say? Not hiding behind a report, but trying to tease out why my understanding of what you're trying to communicate didn't quite work for me. So have you considered framing it slightly differently, or drawing on this literature, or teasing this point out further? And that kind of conversation and dialogue, I think we're seeing much more in terms of refereeing, and much more in terms of, say, the workshops that conferences, international events, seminars can provide in terms of building capacity and prioritizing those kinds of values within scholarly activity.
Alan, do you read outside of environmental education?
It's difficult with our busy lives, so I've tended to go more for shorter form stuff recently, like poetry. One of my favorite poets is Mary Oliver. She writes a lot about her experience in nature and her reflection on being in the world. One of my favorite poems from the 1970s was one by Robert Hass, Meditation at Lagunitas. I'll just try and tell you a couple of lines from that which help me think differently about my experience in the world. The poem starts with, all the new thinking is about loss. In this, it resembles all the old thinking. The idea, for example, that each particular erases the luminous clarity of a general idea. And as the poem continues, it talks about people's experiences, their connection, their understanding of being in the world, what they feel as their desire, and how that relates to different aspects of the way the world is changing. And it ends with a wonderful line about, there are moments when the body is as numinous as words, days that are the good flesh continuing. Such tenderness, those afternoons and evenings, saying, blackberry, blackberry, blackberry. And I think in moments like that, it just reminds me that there's more to life than academia, but also to be present and to think carefully about how I structure my day, but also how I contribute to the lives of others in the things I eat, the things I consume, my relationships, my worldview, my growth, the things I need to let go of, there are so many different aspects which just a simple poem can really encourage us to reflect on and meditate on, like that simple meditation.
What about longer books?
I don't find I have the appetite for longer books as much as I used to, but I've always enjoyed the work of people like George Orwell. It reminds me very much of the need to think about totalitarian thought and how societies change in response to different political ideologies, and how an individual, how a collective, how the dynamics of different ways of living evolve and shift over time, and how those can be abused. So I will often return to that, and I love the fact that my children have engaged with 1984, Animal Farm in their own studies, but also for their own reading pleasure. In terms of some of the other work which I like to dip into, I think we all enjoy things like airport books, not necessarily the fluffy kinds. Sometimes I enjoy the harder reads, whether Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow is seen as one of those, but that again reminds me about different ways of making decisions. One of my favorite pickups from an airport was The Marshmallow Effect, which taught me a lot about different notions of resilience, and I really like the picture of how you squeeze a marshmallow and how it recovers, bounces back. To me, finding effective ways of communicating is what I like when I'm reading, whether it's fiction or non-fiction.
5 words that describe Alan Reid.
Hopefully someone who is engaging for you and for others, someone who listens, someone who thinks, someone who cares, and someone who likes to have fun.
Can you describe your ultimate mission in environmental education in a sentence or two?
My mission, my contribution to the field is hopefully to grow the field and support others in reaching the heights that it can get to, and also the depths that it needs to get to. So working alongside others, collaborating, contributing, sharing, supporting, helping, leading, learning, all of the different verbs which make the educational experience really important. So keeping a learning disposition at the heart of what I do and the heart of the field, so that it can continue to contribute to the challenges that we face.
Would you tell us about 1 or 2 childhood experiences that still influence you in your career?
My adoptive parents and my birth parents were all involved in education at different degrees. So whether I think of my birth mother or my adoptive mother, having someone who is interested in education, particularly primary school age education, has always been important to me, and particularly learning how to communicate. I have had many experiences of running things I've written past my mums and seeing what they think of it, and them saying, "Ellen, I don't understand. You need to express that in a different way." So enjoying that relationship from my own time at school, but also in shaping my career, has been really important. So as I say to my students often, if you imagine sitting on a bus talking to the person next to you about your project, what would they ask you? What would they understand? What would you need to explain? I think that those are always good lessons to pick up on and learn from as we try to imagine what's important to communicate to others about our own passions.
Your advice how to prioritize things and be on top of all the tasks.
So the main challenge for me with being busy is making sure that you don't burn out. Having a support network around you, contributing to others' support, so that there's some level of reciprocity in keeping focused on doing good work and asking the question about what is good work that I can engage with now. Also knowing when to step back and let others to pursue that good work, because it may not be for me to do this kind of thing. It may be for others, it may be their time. It may also be for me to be working with others to learn from them. And I think that's especially important as people's careers progress, to understand that there's always new things to learn. There are things to unlearn, there are things to relearn, there are new forms of learning to engage. So within a busy career, making time for professional development, for being mentored, for leading others, learning from students, learning from colleagues, learning from your elders, All of those things keep you energized, fresh, challenged, motivated, all sorts of things which hopefully again can lead to fun and excitement and challenge and curiosity and all of those good words we love to use.
What kind of questions do environmental educators and environmental education researchers should ask themselves?
So one of the things I instantly think of with a question like that, Alex, is it a good question? Now, there are ways of answering whether something is a good question, but keeping on asking the question, do I have a good question, is central to any academic community. Exposing that question to the scrutiny of others, making it public rather than a private question, is also how we take part in a community of practice, a community of scholarship, one which is hopefully learning over time and asking, is that good question a good question for now, or was it a good question in the past? Will it still be a good question for the future? Do we need other types of good questions? That gets us to a question of quality as well. And like with environmental quality, having this focus on quality is one which we can always use as a regulative ideal, but also a challenge to ourselves. One of the key things I learned from my PhD supervisor, Bill Scott, was to keep asking the question, if you had to reinvent the field right now, if you had a blank sheet of paper, what would environmental education be now if it started now? And how would people recognize it? And how would people want to see it develop if it had started from today? And I think that's a really good way of shaking our thinking about, are we trapped by the past? Are we open to the future? Are there better ways of thinking about the relationship, say, between education and the environment? And I'd encourage everybody to keep asking such kinds of questions, being in relationship with people who can challenge and stimulate you to think in new ways, to shake off old ways of thinking, to be open to the presence of new ideas and experiences, a bit like the poem which I mentioned before.